I have said it all before and I will be explaining it in detail here. Compound 26 by Krista is a young adult dystopian romance that is bad for children to read. I knew very little about the series except that it was first in a young adult novels that were about a dystopian apocalyptic world where a plague had taken over and ravaged the world. Anyone who knows me knows I am a sucker for dystopian novels of all kinds. So I started listening to chapter 1 and guys, the story is comically bad. Like, so bad it crossed over into fun crack fiction territory. So bad, I stopped listening partially through chapter 1 and stopped to do research about this author and this book. Because I had to understand the how and the why of this, and I needed to know now. My findings were that Compound 26 is the first book in a young adult series that Krista published in February 8th, 2018. She describes this genre as fantasy and paranormal romance. So I think it's possible in this post-apocalyptic plague world there will be a steamy forbidden romance. Sets off alarm bells for me, because to me that says there's going to be a doctor-patient relationship, and I don't think that's appropriate to portray as a romance in a young adult novel. As I am here with you in the future, I can tell you we're going to have a lot to unpack about that later. This specific series is not available on Kindle Unlimited, but Krista does have a ton of Kindle Unlimited stories. Her latest 14 books are all available on Kindle Unlimited, and they are adult romances with either shifters or fae. And these more current romances have disproportionately gotten more attention than this young adult work has, with the first book in one of her fae series having 1,000 reviews on Goodreads, for example, versus the 250 reviews that you can find for this book. And that's remembering that the fae book was published in 2023 and this book was published in 2018. The ebook version for Compound 26 was available for free on Amazon, so I did end up reading and listening to this in tandem for maximum comprehension. And surprise of all surprises, when I opened up this ebook, there's actually a preface in it that is not available on the audiobook version. The first line is, "If you're new to the Makanza series," and I was like,
what the hell? This is the first book. Of course I'm new to the series.
But yeah, it tells me if you're new to the Makanza series, you may want to start with the fast-paced, emotional first installment, The Second Wave. Book 0? What the fuck? I understand that it's been a trend recently for there to be like half installments and these usually to be like little steamy interludes or whatever. I don't like it, but I accept it because you can read the whole installments of the books without ever reading those steamy interludes, and it's no big deal. But now we're just adding random book 0 because otherwise I won't understand the first book in your series.
Ma'am, are you alright?
So I did go look at the Second Wave book very briefly, and I found out that I would have to pay $2.99 to purchase, and it's only 121 pages long. I think I'll pass. But some information you might want to know is this book was published an entire 8 months after book 1, which says to me Krista probably didn't bother to get any beta readers or editors for book 1. She was getting a lot of feedback from reviewers that said they didn't understand what was going on or it didn't make that much sense, so she decided to write a book 0 and direct people over there. And to be just like a little bit serious for a moment, this book is meant for young adults. The first thing you see when you open the book is a recommendation to go buy another book. Presumably, this is kind of marketing to children, which is illegal in the United States. And beyond that, I just think it's slimy because I think of my teen self and like 12 to 15-year-old Jess probably would have immediately run out to buy book 0. And then like 16 to 19-year-old Jess probably would have known better and like read a little bit of book 1 first to see if I even like the thing or to see if I need that sort of like extra background. But that's the thing, is young adult covers like a whole spectrum of age range and mindset, and you have to think about like what a 13-year-old would do with this information versus what a 19-year-old would do with this information. I am choosing to believe that Krista just included a thoughtless self-promotion moment, not really considering the audience, since most of her work is intended for full adults instead of young adults, and this isn't like an intentionally slimy thing she did. But I still think it's worth pointing out this was a gross choice she made, something that she added in after the fact because it's not in the audiobook version. And thankfully for me and for all of you curious viewers out there, we do get a page-long summary on what the Second Wave is about. Looks like main character is going to be Davin, who is half Native American, and he's going back to visit his father on a reservation when the second wave of this deadly virus breaks out on the Native American reservation. How confident are we that this was handled with any kind of sensitivity? A direct quote. The warning alarm bell splits the soft April sky's eve, the vast South Dakota prairie. And not to be pedantic, how do alarm bells split the sky? Like, I know people can sing a note so high pitched that it breaks glass, but an object like the sky can't really break. And I have heard like tear the sky, break the sky when we're talking about things like lightning, but that's a physical thing you can see in the sky, and the strikes there do look like they're cutting the sky in two. I even accept if we use thunder as like tear the sky or break the sky because it is related to the visual of lightning, but alarm splitting the sky just sounds fucking weird. Like, I don't know what you're trying to get across to me. And I am immediately doubting that the Native American part of this story was handled with any kind of sensitivity, because Davin's dad's house is described as ramshackle. You know, maybe this is a slight on Davin's dad and not a slight on reservations or Native American living situations as a whole, but considering how reservations are stereotypically portrayed, I'm very concerned. I mean, also the whole premise is very suspicious because the US government has this history of medical experimentation on Native American peoples. For there to have been a viral outbreak and it to have been cured or contained or whatever, and then for it to mysteriously have a second wave that happens specifically on a Native American reservation. And then Davin survives this viral outbreak, but he's on the run from the United States government because he apparently can spread the disease even though he survived it. And like, I understand why the US government wants to catch anyone who could spread this pandemic illness, but the US government hunting down a Native American person also not feeling great. On top of that, the fact that the virus gave Davin superpowers, and as of right now, he's the example we have of a survivor of this pandemic. So I don't know if this is like a normal thing the pandemic does in this world, or if this is like a Davin indigenous person specific kind of thing, but it is like harkening back to like that magical tribal person, and I don't like us dipping into that stereotypical well either. I'm not saying the book can't be fine, but I am saying I'm a lot more concerned about what we are about to read, because presumably Davin will be involved in some of the story I'm about to read going forward too, and that doesn't feel great. Starting with chapter 1, First Day, I'm not going to go through every single one of these chapters. We would be here for a million gajillion years if we did that, but I am going to pick apart this first chapter just so you understand what we're working with. And I do think the first chapter is like especially weak, even compared to other chapters in the book, which is sort of the opposite of what you want. Like, if anything, you want a very strong first chapter to lead the readers in, and then sort of like let things fall apart a little bit in the middle and then tighten it up in the back end so people feel like satisfied with the full breadth of story. I mean, ideally you just want it to be a great story beginning, middle, and end, but if you are going to have weak patches, you probably don't want it to be in the first chapter. I understand why they're giving the audiobook of this away for free, because if I hadn't been listening to it, I probably wouldn't have made it past this first chapter. Hell, the first line is, considering my first day at the compound fell on the 10-year anniversary of the first wave, I should have felt driven, purposeful, even proud. Instead, I couldn't take my eyes off the wall ahead. For starters, there's two vocab words in here without giving us any context. That's going to be compound and first wave. Luckily, I'm a pro at post-apocalyptic pandemic fix, so I know compound is some kind of medical research center and first wave is like the first time this virus ran through the folks. It's pretty basic, so I think probably a lot of people could get it, but it's also throwing enough jargon in the beginning for me to be like,
why couldn't you spread that out a little bit?
Secondly, this first sentence uses passive voice, and passive voice creates distance between the reader and the action happening in a story.
Why would you do that, especially at the first line?
And then I just have questions like, does it matter that her first day was on the 10-year anniversary of the first wave? Is this a clumsy way to tell me how long this virus has been a thing? And if so, why couldn't we have done this like through a radio, maybe announcing a 10-year anniversary, a remark from one of the security guards at the compound, perhaps one of the scientists at the compound saying something? Like, why was it so important to give me this information first line and for it to be in like a mental running dialogue of this girl? You're telling me how she should have felt, driven, purposeful, and proud. but it's not telling me about how she does feel. Like, what would be the opposite of driven, purposeful, and proud? The line overall was a very bad first impression, and it has me now on the lookout for a couple pretty common errors. How does the author establish this world? What's different in it? What's the same in it? Does everything that's established make sense and maintain internal consistency? And from this one sentence specifically, I want to know what's the public's overall exposure to the compound, because she seems pretty surprised by its appearance. What our character would know specifically before coming to the compound, because presumably she's had some training to get here. If our character was feeling all or even mostly positive feelings about the compound, how has just seeing it transitioned us into a sense of dread? You know, presumably this feeling is foreshadowing what we're going to come to learn about the interior of the compound, but I don't understand how just seeing a big building would make you feel that way. If I thought mostly positive things and then I saw a big building, I'd be like,
The larger the resource, the better to keep this thing contained. The more people inside working on it.
like, there is a way to spin a big compound with a large tall wall that makes sense in a world that's been ravaged by a virus. I'm also looking out for main character girl. Do we ever get a sense for who she is or what she actually feels? Or are we always defining her by what she is not feeling or thinking? And then lastly, I'm sort of looking at the quality of writing and what level we are at right now. The next line is not that much better. The tall, dark wall stood resolutely against the azure sky. It looked menacing and bleak. These lines are really awkward phrases. If they'd said anything of value, I'd still want them rewritten, but as they stand, I'd probably just strike through. How does a wall stand resolutely? Also, resolutely is the beginning of a treasure trove of adverbs, all trying to force the reader's understanding. Instead of like natural creative writing that would show the reader enough of this world, maybe even trusting the reader to come to their own conclusions safely based off of actions and gesture. Don't these two lines kind of say the same thing? The tall dark wall stood resolutely. Okay, so there's a big wall there. Against the azure sky, it looked menacing and bleak. Brief side tangent here, but Robert Frost has a fairly well-known poem called Mending Walls, and it examines the pros and cons of maintaining a wall. It outlines why some people in a community take down a wall. And it also explains why this man and his neighbor rebuild the wall together despite all the labor it takes them. It discusses why he and his neighbor disagreed if such a wall was needed. The neighbor repeats his father's wisdom, good fences make good neighbors. And the narrator sort of disdains the neighbor's inability to think more critically. I mention this poem because I first read it when I was in the 8th grade. aka 14. I again read it with my class in 9th grade, and my interpretation of the poem when I read it on my own versus when I had a teacher sort of facilitate further conversation and understanding was completely different. Having a teacher there to help me like open up my mind and think about different ways that walls could or couldn't help people in societies, why one might classically think of a wall one way or another way. All of that was like part of the conversation. It was a full 50-minute lecture on this one poem. So a young adult book examining the purpose of a wall and providing stakes in an age-appropriate manner could very easily play into the same kind of discussion and theming that I found in my 9th grade English class, which is part of why it was so disappointing that this wall situation was handled so uncritically. If this was really the only way to interpret walls, we would have to ask why such a wall had been built in the first place, and how come our protagonist is the first person to ever interpret the wall this way. Famous, readily available, common use works like Frost's poem exists, and we could have even incorporated something like that into this narrative to discuss both sides of this issue. Next paragraph, our narrator says, I jumped, bumping my thigh against the steering wheel. And the first thought I had is,
why is the security check so unnerving for this girl?
if she's been training for this job, presumably it has to be someplace with security. Another personal side tangent, but I have worked on a military base before. My first time going to the base, I had to fill out paperwork, and I went with somebody else who sort of like cleared me to go through so I could get my appropriate credentials to go on and off base on my own in the future. There's lots of experiences of how a person goes on base. Like if you have a family member who lives on base, you guys meet at the guard shack, you fill out some paperwork, you give your ID, and then you get to go on base with whoever you're visiting. She should have all her shit together, or she should have a coworker there walking her through the process. This is all very disorganized. And that like threw me out of the story because it doesn't feel very believable. It feels like another moment where like,
oh, woe is me, poor little girl.
Even if you're not thinking about like a military base, like I have worked other places that required security checks to go in and out. Security checks are very clearly labeled. I went up, I identified who I was, I went through required safety training or whatever kind of training was needed. It's all very clearly labeled, and people are generally pretty friendly, and they usually know to be expecting you. It's not usually a surprise to them when new people come to the gate. This is both a world building and character building gripe I have. The procedure as a whole is not well thought out, and it's not following the standard procedure in our world today, but also this character's reaction in this moment doesn't feel appropriate. And y'all might be thinking like,
Jess, this is a book for teens. It doesn't have to be that realistic or grounded.
But here's the thing, like in the 10th grade, I read The Hot Zone. And I know that's a nonfiction plague pandemic book, but it is very detailed about all the protocol, security, both to keep the virus in check, but also like to keep the right people in the right places. And I was fascinated by all of it. I learned so much reading that book, like an osmosis that we want in young adult stories. And I don't understand why you couldn't do that in a fictional story too. This story drops a ton of made up acronyms into it. And from a realism point of view, that does make sense. Like if you're working in the army or any of these other sort of confidential areas, they use a lot of acronyms to shorten like their group names or the kind of devices they use or anything like that. But there's also an issue with it because in all government paperwork, when acronyms are used heavily, the first use always gives you the full name, parentheses with the acronym in between. And this author doesn't follow the first use case. So there were acronyms that were introduced before the title of the thing was introduced, and I found that incredibly jarring and frustrating. Also, once you introduce the acronym, that's the only way you describe that thing going forward in a paper. And this author flip-flopped back and forth between using the long-ass full name and the acronym. Once you've agreed on a nickname, just use the nickname. So then we're going through an exposition dump while we're going through superfluous and uncreative different levels of security clearances. Like, yes, secure facilities do have more than one check because some people are allowed in some places and not in others, but the way those checks are handled are so much more streamlined than what's happening in this book. And the exposition dump here is so shallow, I don't even know why it was included. The virus hit, it took 2 years to make these compounds. Second wave hit 6 years ago despite the work that was happening in these compounds? Question mark? No one knows how the virus got out. Very, very suspicious since it was first released on a Native American reservation. These compounds do all the virus research and also double as housing any survivors of the virus as they could infect other people. And in this exposition dump, this one line in specific was very frustrating. If the innocent causes inside of them weren't allowed out, and they weren't allowed the basic human freedoms the rest of us took for granted, how could they not be prisons? Basically, this girl is for the first time examining the treatment of these pandemic survivors. And I've got to ask,
ma'am, what other basic freedoms and rights are they being denied? Are we being transparent about this and we're all just okay with it? If we know that human rights violations are happening and we've decided it's for the greater good, but you still think that you're treating these people as prisoners and that's bad, then why are you part of this group?
I do understand the only people who can work on the virus have to work in these compounds and have to interact with these virus survivors. So if you want to help look for a cure, you kind of have to. But you're going to come out and say that you're part of a group depriving innocent people of human rights. Like, what kind of person signs up for a job here? And am I supposed to believe that you are a good person or just like this little naive wilting flower after this moment? I do kind of think that this is like an example of poor or unconfident writing. It's like the author wasn't sure you would get that what was going on in these compounds was wrong if she said that we involuntarily locked them up. She had to go one step further and said we were denying them other human rights as well.
Way to underestimate your audience.
And it's also kind of like a way to squander the needs of the many versus the needs of the individual, because we could have had that conversation, or possibly to like have compared this involuntary confinement to the way that we sometimes put a psychiatric hold on a person so they don't become a danger to themselves or others, which I think could be speaking to like an issue that's relevant to teens, because certainly when I was a teen, and things could be done different now because that was a million years ago, one of the topics that we would talk about fall into like depression and potential suicide ideology, and how if you were really a friend, you would talk to a teacher or a family member or some other trusted adult to get that person help, even if they like told you a secret and told you to keep it a secret, because that person might actually mean to harm themselves, and you need to intervene before they get that opportunity to do that. And of course that ends up with that person potentially going to a psychiatric ward and being held against their will. So like there is a potential connection here between the victims of this pandemic being held to keep everyone else safe and to keep themselves safe, and how one might involuntarily be held at a psychiatric institute or like get a friend sent away if they were having severe ideation, how that would be the right thing, even though in some ways that would be a violation of their rights, why that would be a right thing. Like there's a lot of intricacies and nuances and things we could have discussed. But now I'm just fixated on the fact that we're denying these people other things too. Like what other things? How bad is it? Why are we doing that? Major character immaturity alert, but our main character Megan has her bag searched. And in her zipper pocket is a tampon, and she is embarrassed that someone else has seen that she has tampons or that she ever has to use them. Megan is 23. That's way too old to still be embarrassed that you have basic biological functions and that you need products to deal with that. Would Megan have been embarrassed if she'd had a deodorant stick in there because she needs to reapply her deodorant? Would Megan have been embarrassed if she had a toothbrush in there because she likes to brush after lunch? I just don't understand all of this, like,
I'm horrified by my period.
I really thought as a society we had grown past that sort of like shaming, shunning moment, and especially even if we hadn't, 23 is so flippin' old to feel that way still. I don't think it's good to be like projecting this onto teens or like forcing them to consider that this is something they should be embarrassed or ashamed about. Especially because the writing here doesn't do very good differentiating between how Megan feels and maybe how Megan should feel about this kind of thing. The narrative might be reinforcing that you should feel embarrassed about this kind of natural bodily thing. I did wonder if this was like an outdated attempt to connect to a younger audience, like,
hello fellow kids, I too am embarrassed about puberty and things that happen to you after puberty.
I'm sure that doesn't foretell any other cringy things that will happen in this book though. So hitting the end of chapter 1, I know what topics I'm going to be covering going forward in the review. Megan's characterization, Megan's brother Jeremy and my pet theory with him, the world building, the portrayal of race, and then lastly, gender stereotypes and how misogyny is treated in this book. Start back with Megan. I can't tell you how many times I wrote in this book,
is this how a 23-year-old would act?
I know college has been extended, as has adolescence, so perhaps a lot of kids are acting a lot younger now than they did when I was 23. It's been a hot minute. But when I was 23, I was out of college and working a job full-time. So I had a very different mindset than Megan is displaying here. And most other 23-year-olds I know were more like me. I don't think I know a single 23-year-old that acted like Megan does. And I do want to be really generous. There is something to be said about the level of social isolation Megan has faced in her life as a result of this pandemic. And also as a result of her like intense, accelerated studying to get to this point of doctor way earlier than you normally would have. But I don't really understand the choice to make her so self-conscious and easily embarrassed, like as a result of her lack of socialization. I would think it's just as likely that you would be confidently socially awkward as it would be that you would be very timid and embarrassed. Her like always sweating through a million shirts and like practically on the verge of tears every time she has to say hello to someone is extraordinarily frustrating, and I think it plays back into stereotypes about women and how they respond to things and how they should or should not be. And I do kind of have to wonder why she is so socially removed and how she got into all these accelerated programs if she can't ever communicate to anyone, say what she wants, write effective papers, collaborate with other people, adequately share her ideas, her smarts, her intuition, or knowledge base. If you can't do these core things, what is even the point of getting all the way here to Compound 26? I think when you pair this with the lack of oddities and all the other scientists, it strikes me as especially jarring.
Why are all these other people so socially adjusted and normal, and Megan is out here being like a very anxious little freak?
For someone who is so socially anxious and who is always wondering what other people think or feel about her, like to a degree that feels almost self-centered, she is mind-bogglingly slow. We are halfway through the novel when she enters Davin's room, turns around, sees the glass wall she's been observing Davin in this whole time, and realizes how invasive that is. There's no way for him to like create privacy. She is constantly worried about what the Kazis think of her, and she's constantly worried about how other people see her, but it never even occurred to her that somebody else might at some point in time like privacy. The childlike way she addresses different various moral quandaries is pathetic for a 23-year-old. She lacks conviction or backbone and consistently waffles between various points, justifying how she and her scientific friends are good actually, and quitting would be the greater evil because someone who cares less than her might take over, even though she can do nothing to materially improve other people's living condition. She considers reporting the torture of another human being to her superiors, and I do mean literal torture. Like they're electroshocking this guy. And then she never does it because, I don't know, she forgets to, or maybe she feels like it wouldn't have any end results. And if this book had handled Megan like she was morally gray or critically flawed in some kind of way, shape, or form, I probably could have gotten over some of these things. But they're always talking about Megan like she is such a good, pure, just little snowflake being. She's always making the right choices and doing the right things. And that makes these sort of like lapses sort of less forgivable because you're sort of like telling teens a lot of these things are okay. Like it's just okay to be a self-centered, callous kind of person and still think of yourself as perfectly good and just. I don't know if she has social anxiety disorder or if she's neurodivergent in some way, but it sort of vaguely feels like the narrative is alluding to that. As far as like the anxiety portion, I found the representation both good and bad. I appreciated that she was anxious just because she was anxious, because I have anxiety and sometimes that happens to me too. I didn't really appreciate her lack of coping mechanisms. Like, I have a host of coping skills. Should I start to feel anxious or should I start having an anxiety attack? And she just doesn't have any of that. And I also a little bit wonder about her clearance into a base in a facility like this. Like, a lot of times they check to see if you have any kind of anxiety disorders, if you struggle with depression, so on and so forth for clearance into these sort of projects. I would have liked if we had discussed that a little bit. I think it's the combination of these two things. Like, they would be keeping track to see if someone had high anxiety or depression or whatever, and then you would have had to have developed some high-level coping skills, because otherwise you wash out of these sort of programs. So like, I would have liked a more forged in fire kind of character who, yes, they had this anxiety, yes, they still had these lapses, but they had a bunch of coping techniques, a bunch of ways to deal with this sort of thing. They had stuff they could rely on. Maybe they even had a therapist they reach out to if it gets past a certain level of tenseness. This is the kind of representation and portrayal I want. It's not just enough to have these feelings or these moments. We need to go on to the next step, which is trying to deal with and cope with that in a healthy way. And because we didn't get into specifics about the neurodiverse element, I sort of started to read it more as like, she's a girl in STEM, so she's just built different than I did like potentially neurodivergent, which kind of made me wonder, like,
is this book saying that you have to be like this girl to be a successful female in STEM research?
It's soft enough that if it was in an adult book, I wouldn't necessarily care, but here in a young adult book where it's like,
empowering girls, go be in STEM, fight back against sexism.
But also like,
I'm very socially awkward and I get anxious right away, and it seems like my brain doesn't work like a normal girl's brain. I'm not like other girls. I'm quirky.
What is the message here? I don't think that it's positive. Another thing I found really troubling is, does Megan have an eating disorder or not? To be clear, I do not think the text wanted me to read the situation as Megan having an eating disorder. But she does count her calories and track her weight. And she figures out her overall access to food in a way that immediately flagged as a red flag to me. I know in the context of this world, they have like divvied up groceries and stuff so that everything is rationed and only certain people can have certain things, and some people are going hungry. So like, knowing exactly how much you need to live, knowing how much you have credits for, all that kind of stuff becomes very important. And I think maybe in and of itself, I could have like let that go as an interesting world building moment, but then she chooses to punish herself by not eating food. She also gets so busy that she forgets to eat, like pretty frequently, and she will watch what she eats because of other people's perceptions or because she feels bad because of other people, all of which like smacks of disordered eating. reinforcing for a young adult audience that disordered eating is okay if you have a good reason for it. It's a very weird way for her to tackle some of these problems too, because she says like she has more than enough food thanks to being in the compound and them giving them like unlimited access for lunch and like all this coffee and cookie treats and stuff for snacks. And she's like,
And I'm gonna forgo all of that because other people can't have it.
Like,
girl, what? You should eat as much as you can at the compound, maybe even take some of that lunch food home for dinner, and then take all of your credits and donate it to a family that's hungry. I just don't understand you, girlfriend.
also, her whole eating and not eating thing affects her weight significantly. And again, I thought that was huge red flag territory. If she's so depressed she's not eating, or she's so upset she's not eating, and she's losing a lot of weight as a result, like, that's not good. That's like intervention territory. And I am asking the whole time, is Megan moral? I think the story wants me to believe that she is a good person. The story's told from her perspective and she seems to be striving to do good, but a lot of the things she says and does makes me feel like maybe she's not a good person after all. The first time she sees Davin's bodily autonomy violated so that they can force him to do as they want using pain, she's horrified, but she doesn't report it to any superiors who might be able to intervene, and she goes back to work the next day and never comments on it to any. So like, what good is her internally being horrified if she does everything the same? She maintains friendships and continues to think positively of researchers who have been doing unspeakably terrible things to these survivors of the pandemic, long after she finds out they've done horrible things. And she'll even point out like how thoughtless or cruel they are, or how much such and such thing must hurt, and the researchers will be like,
yeah, I guess so,
and just keep going. And Megan's like,
They're so smart.
I don't know how I'm supposed to feel about her being fine with that response from them. It sort of smacks to me of like someone saying like,
Oh, I'm not racist.
while they continue to maintain very close friendships with people who are obviously racist. I know I could be placing a certain level of guilt by association onto Megan, but she is working in a facility that is doing horrible things to innocent people. Her coworkers and people she is friendly with and admires are the ones doing the terrible things and gloating about all the research and progress they're making by doing these terrible things. How close do you have to be to the Nazi before you become the Nazi, you know? Megan does talk about the Milgram experiments, which was a Stanford prison experiment that actually happened in our own real world. But honestly, we needed a lot more than just the one reference. And Megan needed to like compare a lot of the actions of herself and her fellow guards a lot more closely than she was. The whole point of the story was for Megan to identify herd mentality and then for her to shake herself out of that herd mentality to do the right thing. But she like one-off said she was gonna do that and then never actually did it. Even if Megan's anxiety keeps her from pushing back in the moment of that single social pressure point, the fact that she never like emails a superior, anonymously announces concerns, talks to press or media, anything that might bring about change, talks to someone at another compound even, especially when we find out that treating the pandemic victims well actually yields better results, like reach out to that compound superiors and tell them what's going on in your compound and how they're like slowing down research or something. And I think even outside of her anxiety, it would have been good to show that if you freeze in a moment, that's not your one and only chance to correct an injustice. There are other steps outside of direct confrontation one could take to still do the right thing. And I'm continually fixated on whether or not Megan was actually an appropriate hire for this program. To be fair, this is probably not a question a teen would ask about the book or its setup, but I have to argue that Megan is so nervous, like too nervous to do this job. If I were a person vetting for this high security clearance kind of position, I would be worried that she would be socially pressured into giving away our state secrets. I would count her out of the running immediately. And I'd argue with how like innocent and moral Megan is and generally naive. Like there's no way she'd make it through basic training to work at the compound. And there's certainly no reason that someone from the compound would select her to come in and work at the program. Also, she did have a bunch of in-person training and like testing for her to get selected to work at the compound. So she has had experience around people recently and time to adjust. The level of her anxiety to me just does not seem reasonable. And I think it might have been good because the general training is for all the different compounds and then you get like selected to go to one of them, and like the one that she selected to go to is especially mean or whatever, right? So like she's not a good fit for that compound, but she might have been a good fit for one of the others. So if we'd gotten like an inside look, maybe instead of this being her first day at any compound, this is her first day at this compound after being transferred, that might have been more realistic, because she could have been a great fit over there, and then when she comes here, that's when things become a problem. This is sort of anecdotal, but like as someone who worked in food service, retail, and hospitality, I ended up training a lot of teens for those jobs, and they often had this mentality that it was like just retail or just a first job or only hourly work or whatever, and they could do whatever they wanted however they wanted to, and of course they were qualified and were doing a great job just by being there. Not all of them, but a lot of them had that attitude, and it was often like very upsetting for them when I would have to sit them down and tell them that they weren't doing a good job or they weren't meeting the base requirements to keep working at that position. It's like they had never ever considered that they might not be qualified to do a certain kind of job, or they might not even want to do a certain kind of job. And I really think if we explored that more in fiction, that could help them be more prepared for this particular reality. For such a nervous girly, Megan is very horny on me. This book describes everybody physically, and because it is told in first person, it's Megan talking about how incredibly attractive and fashionable everyone is. And noting everyone's fashion is definitely a choice, considering all of the fashion industries have been shut down thanks to the pandemic, and there's just warehouses of clothes that we all go thrifting at. What are we even talking about being fashionable in this state? But here Megan is reaffirming traditional beauty standards, emphasizing the importance of an appearance someone can't necessarily help, reinforcing a teen's tendency to be superficial and judgmental right away, recognizing name brands and classic fashion even long after that kind of name brand thing is no longer a company or a brand or in existence in her world, and hasn't been for a decade. Falls into the trope that good people are attractive and stylish, and that bad people usually have something visually wrong with them. And it also kind of falls into like that bad writing trope where what people wear is who they are, which again, she goes out of her way to explain that they all go thrifting at warehouse shops and have to take what there is. So the fact that these people have figured out a way to do style, and that that's a thing that matters in the face of all that, is very weird. And let's talk about that Davin-Megan romance for a minute. So because of how this pandemic virus spreads, Megan and Davin are never going to be able to physically touch. They can only be in the same room when Megan wears a full bodysuit. This creates a setup where Megan and Davin can only have a completely clean romance. There's no touching, there's no kissing, there's nothing physical about their relationship, and they're never can be. I don't necessarily have a problem with either clean or pure romances for teens or adults, but I do have a problem with a romance where there can be no physical touch or comfort ever, and that's just part of the relationship baked in. Megan is a doctor, Davin isn't just a patient, he is a prisoner who is being unethically treated, and she is the jailer. There's no version of their relationship that can ever happen that can be ethical. But let's ignore that power dynamic just a minute, because there's a couple other like superficial moments or issues I want to talk about first. When Megan first sees Davin, she is instantly and immediately attracted to him. Given the fact that all of these pandemic patients live in a cell like they're being animals viewed in a zoo, it's disgusting that she would have a attractiveness reaction to these people. Like, either treat them like they're people and be horrified about the situation, or treat them like they're animals and then don't be attracted to them. But this is very weird mixed messaging for her to be like,
They're people, they're animals, they're people, they're animals.
like back and forth. She hasn't decided where she lands with them. Davin is a sexy person / animal, which also is problematic because he is a Native American, and they keep focusing on his Native Americanness and also how they're treating the pandemic people inhumanely. The second time Megan sees Davin, she witnesses him being tortured, and she is with the torturers, okay? It's not like some kind of separate thing. I don't get the warm fuzzies from watching someone being tortured, and also I don't know that it's right to have a romance with someone where I was culpable for their torture. Her obsessions with Davin seem odd and weird and creepy, and yet for some reason her caring so much and being so obsessed and fixated is what quote-unquote saves him. The close of the book makes it clear that Megan loves Davin and Davin loves her, but we really do have to ask if there's ever a chance for them to have a happily ever after. Just as it takes more than intelligence to be qualified to work at a compound, it takes more than love for a relationship to succeed. An uncritical look at what the future looks like for Megan and Davin isn't really good messaging for teens, because it's basically telling them you get the warm fuzzies for someone and everything else just kind of works itself out. You literally have to find a way to make it work out, because if you get the warm fuzzies, that's love, and love always has to triumph. And that's not true. You can love someone and it cannot work out for a whole bunch of reasons. You can love someone and maybe it shouldn't work out. And I do really have an issue with like the sweet words and the hand holding. Not because it's a clean romance, that's fine. But what makes a clean romance work is that people choose the level of intimacy or affection they want. So long as they continue to do the relationship building work around whatever that intimacy level is, I'm willing to buy into the romantic aspect. But in this case, Davin and Megan cannot choose to be more intimate or not. This is the max level they'll ever have because Davin's infected, and if she's exposed to the virus, she will die. But even beyond that, Compound 26 is the one that gets to make decisions for Davin and Megan. There is a point in time where Megan is fired from the compound because they find out she's been unethically in contact with Davin's mother. They don't care about her relationship with Davin, but they do care about her getting in contact with people outside of the compound. So Megan's no longer allowed to see Davin in the same way that Davin hasn't been able to choose his company pretty much since he came down with this pandemic virus. She's like alone and sad and suffering, and at the end she gets back into the compound, but it's only by agreeing to play by the compound's rules, respecting those rights and those gains. So the same way that Davin is trapped in the compound and only has rights and access based off of what that compound decrees, Megan is only allowed back into the compound and allowed to interact with Davin based off of whether or not the compound is pleased with her too. And I guess now I can't ignore the power dynamic issue for any longer. Megan is Davin's doctor. Megan is Davin's captor. She does nothing to improve his circumstances until it will benefit her scientific research. And there's never a clear distinction between whether or not she's doing these things because it's the right thing to do, or because she loves him, or because it improves the science. It sort of feels like she's just lucky that all of those stars aligned for her so she can go in the one direction and uncritically make those choices. Megan claims that she is staying working as like a captor and a torturer and someone experimenting unethically on people for the sake of the causes, so she can find a cure possibly one day and get them free. But there is no description here of her research, and none of this effort gets her any closer to that goal. She does eventually make a breakthrough between her and Davin that leads to like some more movement on one possible cure for one of the strains of this virus, but it's not going to lead to getting Davin free, and it certainly isn't going to necessarily help with getting any of the other victims of the pandemic free, because they have different strains of this virus and they all need individual vaccine. The story reads more like Megan burying her head in the sand so that she can keep promoting her own scientific research and goals while ignoring the plight of these pandemic survivors. And when she has to actually go into Davin's cell and work directly with him, she's more afraid for herself than she is worried about the treatment Davin is receiving. And this might be part of a result of her anxiety disorder, and if we had been reading a better book and using coping skills for her anxiety, she might have broken down this panic, examined it, felt like the reality versus what was just like her own mind running away from her. But we are so focused in Megan's experience, Megan's feelings, the dangers to Megan, without ever like really understanding who Davin is as a human being, what his fears, worries, anxieties, trials, or tribulations. The book wants to both show the director torturing this man and also somehow make him the evil villain who could take Megan out if he wanted. And then Megan's role in Davin's life grows in importance. She goes from being his medical doctor and his captor to also being his interim psychologist and only confidant. And there's a couple problems with that. First of all, she isn't at all qualified to be a psychiatrist. Next, her help is conditional. Even if she wanted to help him until he felt more secure and stable, she can only help him as long as the compound allows. But also, her desire to get him to open up and be more vulnerable with her isn't for his benefit specifically, it's that she can get what she needs to make a cure. And then it feels like she is using his vulnerable relationship, his over-reliance on her to create a romantic entanglement, which is gross because this is something that satisfies her emotional needs, satisfies her importance in his world, helps her get closer to her goal, and makes her her indispensable to the program overall. But none of these things materially help Davin in any way, shape, or form. And if for some reason she is ejected from the program, or if Davin's no longer helpful to her and so she stops seeing him, Davin is going to be so much worse off than he is now. Megan also becomes Davin's only link to his mother. Like, do you see how many different ways Megan becomes the abuser in this relationship? How she is preying on Davin's vulnerability to create a relationship and connection at all? And somehow this is the couple I'm meant to be rooting for? My unproblematic young adult clean couple romance. So let's go ahead and talk about Jeremy. Megan mentions her younger brother Jeremy in chapter 1 in a way that was odd and I flagged. A few chapters later, she has an awkward dinner with her family, and guess what? No Jeremy. Again, weird. Immediately I needed to know, is Jeremy real at all? Is this a Beautiful Mind style thing? Was Jeremy once alive and now he's dead and she's like talking about him like he's still around? I wondered, maybe is Jeremy real and part of some kind of underground resistance, and they're like a dynamic brother-sister duo where the sister's going into the compound and infiltrating and getting the secrets, and Jeremy is on the ground, foot soldier, trying to get rights and freedoms for these people. Also, I was wondering if Jeremy was like biologically her brother, because he's talked about in a way that's like a little bit uncomfortable. It's fine for someone to acknowledge objectively that family members are good looking, but it also is always like just a little uncomfortable making, and you always sort of have to be specific about the way you phrase things. And I didn't love the way Megan phrased her description of Jeremy. Jeremy comes in and out of Megan's apartment and he offers key tidbits of information at key moments. In the back third of the book, we get the reveal that Jeremy was a kid brother who became victim of the Makanza virus. I was kind of disappointed by this. I was really hoping either for a resistance or for this to be some kind of manifestation of like a delusion she has due to pressure. I mean, I guess the dead brothers thing is fine, but it was really weird. It was there just enough to call attention, but not there enough to feel like connected, satisfying, or like intriguing. And now we have to talk about Susan for a little bit. Susan is a twin, and the two of them are both survivors of the Makanza virus, and their power allows them to mentally communicate with all of the pandemic survivors in the compound, and apparently eventually also with Megan. Her mental voice is a really odd choice, as is her decision to like include one of her captors in their communications. She like immediately is interested in Megan and like is just has an intuition about her and is continually interested. And for the record, I don't get Susan at all or her power set. Like, it seems like it must be more than just the ability to mentally talk to other people. Otherwise, how would she get this like sixth sense about Megan? I don't understand why Susan can do all of these things and it doesn't seem like her twin can do anything. She feels like a plot device, another confidence boost for Megan. I wasn't sure if I really wanted to address her in the world building section or on her own. I ended up putting her here and discussing her like her own character because she should have been a human being with her own characters and her own traits. And I don't want to like add to the problem by treating her like a prop in the world building section. I do think it's a shame because these twins were the two characters with the most potential. Like, they've been in this compound since they were 9. They didn't have any traditional schooling. They did have counseling. At one point in time, they were allowed toys and hobbies. So that leads me to have like a lot of questions. Did these researchers attempt to socialize the two young girls? Or did they just leave them alone for long periods of time like they were adults, despite being the fact that 9-year-olds in our society are rarely left unsupervised for a long period? At what age did they think it was appropriate to start experimenting on these twins? And what kind of experiments do you do on children? We really could have done a lot with an isolated, fractured childhood. It could have gone a long way to like finding the sameness between Megan and them, because Megan's isolation might have been self-imposed and like a result of her rigorous academic study, but she still also was kept away from other children. She also spent long periods alone. She was in mourning for the loss of her brother in a way that they might have been mourning the loss of their family and normalcy as a whole. This sort of commonality could have explained what Susan saw in Megan that made her decide to like reach out to her. And through this connection, it could have like humanized all of the pandemic plague survivors for Megan in a way that otherwise she didn't understand. But the twins don't have thoughts or feelings of their own. They update Megan on what's happening when she's away, and they let her know about how Davin is feeling or coping. And they're worried about Davin, but they are never worried for themselves, and they never have their own interpretation of events. And that moves me into the world building. So this Macanza virus is deadly and has a long incubation period. There's no symptoms, but people are still contagious. So far I'm on board with the general premise and threat of such a virus. The further in we go, there are a couple issues. Like, I really don't 100% understand how this virus spreads. Is it from personal contact? Is it airborne? Is it in the water? To go and visit the survivors of the Macanza virus who still have active virus strain in them, you have to go in on a full bodysuit. And in theory, there are so many like shed dead skin cells and stuff in that one environment that if you walked in, even if that person wasn't in the room, you would still contract Macanza probably, which to me suggests it's airborne, but I think this book like specifically said it wasn't. And if it's not airborne, doesn't that mean you'd have to touch stuff? The other thing is they're trying to gene sequence this virus so they can find a vaccine for it, but it's not stable at room temperature, which again says to me like even if a person can incubate the virus for a long time without symptoms, how exactly are they spreading it to other people? Like, I would think it would be more like HIV than it would be like a physical contact, like the flu kind of situation, which to me doesn't like match up with how quickly this thing spreads or how dangerous it is to be around people with the virus. The X-Men powers that survivors seem to gain from the virus feel very random and aren't as like cool as I think the author believes they are, but I'm kind of willing to go with it because this is like an established trope in young adult or even in virus post-apocalypse in general. The fact that survivors of this virus still have live virus in them and have to be quarantined for the public safety does feel more like a plot convenience than an actual medical thing. I'm not a medical expert, I'm not at all qualified to examine from that point of view, but to like my simple non-medical expert brain, I was like,
I don't think that's a thing.
And while I appreciate we talk about different strains of the Macanza virus, specifically that there's 41 different types and each one needs their own vaccine to actually cure this issue, and also how they're named as like Macanza strain 1 through Macanza strain 41 is technically accurate, just look at our COVID-19. It's still way too many strains for my brain to keep track of, and additionally it did like play a little bit against my general dyslexia and reading tracking struggles. And since we don't deal with all 41 strains in this compound, and we don't talk about how we got 41 separate strains between 2 waves of this disease, I just don't think we need that much variation. Also, I think at the 41 strains, we might want to like start nicknaming each specific strain so it's a little bit easier for like the reader to keep track of things, even if that's not necessarily scientifically accurate. It's not like we gave a crap about how secure compounds would work or how training to get into these compounds would work when it was better storytelling wise for this girl to be like an angsty fall apart mess. I was a little bit torn about the virus's origin being in Africa. On one side, like that's where Ebola was started, so it's not like this is an unlikely place for a random unknown disease to get discovered and sort of like overtake the globe. But on the other side of things, it just feels vaguely racist to take a underdeveloped country and assume that this kind of like unknown death killing thing is just like lying in wait and suddenly gonna pop up and overthrow us all. Also, the way the outbreaks happen are weird. I'm willing to give it to them on the first wave, but the second wave is so suspicious and is just not addressed at all in this book. Maybe if I read further into this series, I'd see like those suspicions are validated and we get to find like a true villain or whatever, but if we don't, and this is just how things happen to fall out in this world, it plays into stereotypes and past history, like specifically with the US government, that feels uncomfortable and like very unexamined, probably unintentional by the author. Another thing I'm constantly calling into question is what is the public's knowledge level here? And to be fair, perhaps this world has collapsed enough that there's no infrastructure or like vehicle for someone to be the truth teller or the whistleblower, but it has been 6 years since the second wave happened, and I feel like people inherently would demand more transparency. There are like friends and family of these survivors who have been cut off from them or who perhaps are going in and out of the compound visiting on the regular. There's hundreds, maybe thousands of scientists and military experts working around the clock inside these compounds, that there would be some kind of information leak, that there would be curiosity around this, that there'd be an underground network like sharing more information and sort of like questioning the government's rules and choices. Just feels like a natural thing that would happen in this kind of world, especially if the people feel that like a certain level of complacency inefficiency and slow action is what got them into this situation in the first place. And it's natural for people to play the blame game and decide that the people in charge just did a shit job, and if they'd done better, then we would have better overall outcomes. So I don't understand why there is no faction like this in Compound 26, and why the information in the compounds seems to have not spread to the larger public. Not even like rumors or whispers of anything. I really think it was a missed opportunity to have some kind of rebellion element or counter narrative to whatever's going on in the compound. Minimally, it would have given Megan someone to play off of once she starts to feel conflicted about what she's observing within the practices of the compounds. And besides giving her someone to like talk out these ethical quandaries she's struggling with, it would have given her more options on where to go or what to do next. It might have led to different, more dynamic and interesting events in the story as a whole. Also, had there been a rebellion, the mental connection that she shares between herself and the Kazis would have had more overall value. She could have shared what the Kazis felt about their imprisonment and what they had actually experienced, like from the horse's mouth. And even though that wouldn't have made this like mental connection OP power we get like more believable, it would have at least served more function and like engaged us in a more interesting way. The government contractor response and the overall structuring, some of this is just fine. Like shortages, the collapse of capitalism, the way that everyone sort of has like tokens and has to go to the store at their scheduled time and it can only take a certain set amount of things and has to kind of make choices. The way they're redistributing like clothing and thrifting because there's not enough for like large scale industry anymore. The fact that people can't really travel the way they used to and there seems to be like a nightly curfew in force. I am okay with those aspects of the world building. I can sort of see it, and I sort of feel like some thought was put into what a world would look like after so many people died from pandemic. The contractor-government relationships, though, make a lot less sense. If all of these compounds are run by a single contractor, they should be functioning in basically the same way. Perhaps each one of them has one single variable that's different than the other compounds, but for each one of them to be working in such extremely different environments, scenarios, and treatment for the Kazis is very weird to me. Obviously, if all the compounds were run exactly the same, this would have had a huge impact on the story, since like some of them treat the Kazis really well and some of them are like torture factories, and the ones that treat their Kazis well are the ones who are making progress, which is like the messaging of the story, like do the right thing and you're rewarded. So not setting this up in a realistic manner really streamlined a heavy-handed kind of message that like overlooks the fact that you should do the right thing by other people because it's the right thing to do. You should treat other people kindly because you should, not because you'll get something back. I think implying that if you treat people well, you will get something in return is actually sort of dangerous messaging, because then if people are treating someone else kindly and they're not seeing any reward for it, they might decide it's not worth being kind anymore since they're not getting their own back. Or they might be pressuring those people into returning a favor they can't actually reward them for. And it kind of also implies that whoever is being kind to the person at the disadvantage, that this is the power structure that will always be in place. So there will always be the person who has the ability to be kind or not kind and never suffer any consequences. And all of that, I think, especially for teens, is like poor messaging. And then let's dive into the science. Again, I am not a science girl. I am terrible at the subject. So at first I thought the science presented here was kind of fine-ish. There is like a magic-ish edge to it combined with some very basic viral science. I really would have appreciated more details about the quarantines, the differing strains, how they identified these strains, how they came about, like how does this virus mutate, and I would have loved like a step-by-step breakdown of the protective gear that we were using and why. The story lost me entirely when the scientific breakthrough was that happy Kazis give more stable virus samples than unhappy Kazis. This trails off into magic woo-woo sort of element. Like there's a scientific experiment where you put different words on a glass of water, like happiness, sadness, sorrow, and then you examine their ice crystals under a magnifying glass and get different kinds of ice crystals, and this proves that you're imbuing emotion into the water. And it was a cool art piece, but there's nothing scientific about it, and sort of like incorporating it here like this feels icky and also feels like it's reinforcing this kind of like bunk weird science. Maybe the author didn't have a good enough grip on science to like actually make a breakthrough that would also streamline with a plot. It was really hard for me to get over this breakthrough and roll into the rest of the story because I just found it so dumb and off-putting. And it's not like we couldn't have done this story arc without this quote-unquote breakthrough. For example, we could have had some kind of outside regulator come in and realize that the treatment of these survivors was inhumane. And then we still could have gone on this healing journey. We still could have dealt with the fact that patients are resisting the scientists based off of this poor treatment and like they all need to come to terms with it. We could even have the director being angry at getting caught by the regulator and like trying to work around him and arguing with the scientists to continue their inhumane whatever. He'd have been more compelling in a lot of ways because he could have argued that what he was doing was purely for the sake of breakthroughs, where like right now why he's being cruel and mean to people is sort of an unknown factor. I guess he's just a bad guy, you know? Where here he could have had like the compelling reason that we need these breakthroughs and this is the only way to do it. Like someone is making the hard decisions. And then when we ultimately prove that he is wrong and he's done damage in the relationship between the scientists and the causes that we have to fix before we can make any forward scientific progress, that's like undoing that relationship, showing the counter argument to how being cruel doesn't get you what you want in like a more meaningful way than just magically the science works out, you have to start being nice to these people. You know, like I'm even okay with Megan making the major breakthrough that sort of like solves this, but the way she does it is so problematic, partially because it tangles into her and Davin's romantic relationship, and it kind of even implies that the two of them have to fall in love for them to cure his strain of Makanza, which is just wild to me. Like, imagine that pressure on Davin's end. Get feelings for this girl, completely trust this girl, or else you're gonna hold back all the scientific research that could save people like you and your brothers in the future. Not to mention that now this is sort of like encouraging a romantic relationship between all of the scientists and other causes, because that romance is what creates the trust and companionability that allows them to pull a stable sample so that they can like mark all the DNA and possibly create a vaccine. Let's move into some of the weird race stuff. I'm not an expert, but to my untrained eye, there was a lot of things that made me feel uncomfortable and that I feel like we should unpack a little bit here. The book itself dives into genetics as part of how to find a cure, but it really bungles that exploration in my own opinion. Like, there is a ton of weird indigenous Native American stuff just sort of included here. I've already kind of flagged the second outbreak happened on a Native American reservation, and that's not cool because a lot of really unsavory medical practices and experimentation have happened on Native American reservations to Native American people historically. On top of that, like, the US government has forced Native Americans onto those reservations, and like the history of that process is just heartbreaking if you ever look into it. Not to mention, like, looking at present day, what Native American reservations have been like reduced to systematically because the US government doesn't like their existence. But then additionally, this book kind of leans into the idea that like the native people have pretty much entirely been wiped out by this virus, and the second wave starting in the reservations, all except for like Davin, is also super uncomfortable because the US government has been trying to get rid of indigenous people for so long that thinking about how a virus outbreak that conveniently happened the second time on the reservations is so uncomfortable, so inappropriate. Like, I can't verbalize how uncomfy this makes me and how much this leans into like predatory aspects of a lot of things, and also leads us into a road of fetishizing Davin in a way that makes me extremely disgusted with our main character. Like, it's okay that Megan finds Davin attractive, you just do or don't find people attractive. And it's sort of okay for her to appreciate certain features of his, but the way that she does it, where she like traces it back to his lineage, his genealogy, like what he would have been like if he had been born in a bygone era, like him on a horseback on the open plains and stuff. Very, very uncomfortable for me. And also kind of like stereotyping Davin, like fetishizing his ethnicity, not really appreciating or asking him what he thinks about his own culture or beliefs, or where he thinks he would have fit into that narratively in a modern day. To a certain degree, all of that is besides the point, because we already said that like Native American people have been wiped out, so effectively he has no culture or society or place to return to even after we cure this thing. I guess we could have talked about him mourning that loss and like talking about richness that he was still trying to uncover because he's half indigenous and has spent most of his life like in mainstream society with just the occasional trip out to the Native American reservation and experiencing Native American culture. But I can't even say like Elizabeth Street was ignorant to how a lot of this might be received or perceived, because she has her main character Megan give this monologue about proud Native Americans being taken out by viruses they had no immunity to thanks to their trading with white settlers. Like the blankets is what did them in. But drawing this parallel between the second wave hitting the Native American reservations and the original meeting of white settlers and indigenous people does not work like she thinks it does. Because when we're talking about like old-timey white settlers trading with Native American people and then passing on diseases that the Native Americans had no protection against, arguably the white settlers are dealing with diseases they have no protections against that are inherent in this land. We're playing with different immunity fields and different levels of exposure. But when we're talking about the Makanza virus specifically, it should not decimate a native population inherently any more than it should the white population, because both of them have zero exposure to it. So instead you're just like harkening back to a sad and painful historical element, and also sort of like whitewashing the other violence and brutality done on native people to kind of like force out their existence. Yes, the viral outbreaks were bad and contributed, but certainly the multiple wars, kicking them off their land, forcing them onto reservations are all things that did not help. So you're like downplaying the history of the native people. You're drawing a comparison from this illness to illnesses of the past in a way that doesn't support your primary thesis. You're doing all of this like stereotypical imagining based off of his history. To say it's off-putting is an understatement. And then on top of that, we come to find out that David's mom is white, his father is Native American. The reason the two of them split is because David's father is an alcoholic. Native American people struggling with an alcohol addiction is something that you can see historically from the settlers' time onward. And it's a real issue in reservations. So sort of like touching on it like this, saying that his mom couldn't take it and broke off with him and left him to fend for himself. Like, what are we doing? Why are we presenting this man in such a stereotypical negative light? Like, yes, this guy eventually recovered and got clean and was living a sober life on a reservation, but I just don't think I would have touched the alcohol element with a Native American character with a 10-foot pole, especially not for like a random backstory for a guy who's already dead. There's a million reasons David's mom and his father could have broken up. It wouldn't have had to like touch on what is like a systemic stereotype for that guy's race, especially because we don't explore what drove Davin's father to drink. We don't humanize his struggle. We are unable to unpack this and humanize it in any kind of meaningful way to make it specific to Davin's dad and break it away from the stereotype that's sort of like plaguing indigenous people. And it's not just Native Americans who get this treatment. There's a lot of really weird Irish stuff in this book. We meet the woman who's gonna get Megan up to speed while she's working on the compound. She has red hair and freckles, and Megan immediately asserts that she is Irish, and this is like emblematic of her Irish heritage, which struck me as kind of like very racist. Like, do all redheads have Irish heritage? I know that not all Irish people have red hair, and I think it's just weird and a little bit gross for Megan to immediately run through genealogy like this and jump to these assertions, especially if she's a scientist and should know that red hair doesn't necessarily work like this. Like, this offhanded comment makes Megan sound like a freak, but I think this was the book's way to show that she specializes in DNA. It just doesn't work because this isn't factual about DNA. And then later, Megan meets a pub owner who I think is family friends with her trainer, or maybe like related to him, but she keeps calling him quote unquote dark Irish. Sounded racist as all get out to me. I had to look up the term. This might not really be an offensive term. It might just be a way to describe someone who has dark hair and is also Irish. But like, why would you need a term for that? Aren't a lot of people with dark hair also Irish? And since the man has an Irish accent and owns an Irish pub, maybe that was enough to indicate he was Irish. Maybe you didn't need any additional descriptors. There's also some like weird Asian stuff going on here. One of the lab assistants is Asian, and how he's described made me very uncomfortable. Nothing I could specifically flag and point out to you as obvious racism like I have in some of these other categories, but I didn't like it. And I think maybe it might have been because of these Irish comments, Native American comments. I was already kind of primed to be like on edge anytime she mentions a race or ethnicity. He gets a few moments here or there, but not enough to really develop a personality, and I did think it was telling that there's a white male lab assistant and he gets so much more screen time and dialogue than this other guy. Even though neither this Asian dude or the white guy are like especially helpful to Megan or a confidant of any kind, he just gets to talk a lot more than the Asian guy does for some reason. And overall, Megan feels very comfortable with this white male colleague. She feels he has an easily likable personality. She thinks the guy has great style. She calls him relaxed. And apparently this Asian coworker she has gets no such qualifiers. That feels like a telling omission to me. And then lastly, this book calls out the entire continent of India and says that everybody there was killed in the first wave. There was no place isolated enough where someone could avoid contracting the virus in India. And this kind of feels like a stereotype of what India is like, because India is flipping huge and there are a lot of remote and isolated villages, towns, places. Just because some of the big cities are overcrowded and have questionable living situations going on there does not mean the whole of India is like that. I actually stopped reading at this point and looked it up, and there's no reason to call India out over like almost any other country. If the Americas managed to make it through, if there are survivors in every country in Europe, I don't know why you would pick India like this as the place where everyone passed away from the virus. And that kind of moves me into some weird gendered things. Women are the minority here in the compound, and this sort of like rolls us back into getting more women in the STEM research kind of area. Megan's the youngest person to ever work for a compound, and the next youngest person is the woman who's training her, and she also is a woman. I did appreciate that the two of them become friends and support each other's work and endeavors. Like, they could have been competitive and mean and like vicious in that stereotypical tropey way of women tearing each other down, and instead they stand like in unity and solidarity and acknowledge how like both of them worked really hard to get where they were and both of them deserve their place. That kind of thing was nice. But there are a lot of girl power moments that to me just don't land. Like Megan, her colleague, and another more senior female end up all congregating and talking about their research and their positions, how they got there, what they're excited to learn more about. Megan's like tunes out of this conversation for a minute, sticks her head up, and sees that like all the men in the surrounding area are just turning and staring at the small congregation of women. To me, that's so cringe. Are women so rare in the compound that seeing three of them together at once like blew all these men's minds? Like, I don't understand. The all-male guard staff portrayed in this book is also pretty odd. Why was there not a single female in security? It doesn't seem like there's like any extreme qualifications for this. Like, you have to pass a background check, but generally speaking, you're just dealing with nerds and radioing for backup if something suspicious is going on. Seems like any gender could do that, and probably would be more evenly gendered given how few people are left in the world. Within the plot, the director is allowed to assign one person on the scientific team to go in and do face-to-face interaction with the viral survivors, and he specifically requires that person be a woman because they're better at that kind of thing. The face-to-face interaction, the nurturing, comfort, putting people at ease element. Gender requiring a role like that in a workforce, especially within the US government, is not a legal thing he can do. The book calls out the sexism of his comment and of his requirement, and everyone agrees it's sexist and then just proceed to follow the decree. This is the part where you involve HR, where you complain to this guy's manager, where you challenge who would be the best person for for the job. I think arguably the affable white guy that is easy to like and quite charming would probably be the best candidate to go in there and like put someone at ease. Both women in his team are a little bit awkward and have some kind of social anxiety or like delayed development or something. So it's weird for the book just to acknowledge it and then just move on from there. Like, you should do something about it, and you should make a statement about how in this case specifically a woman was not the best candidate for this position. But instead, in some ways, the book actually proves this director's assertion correct, because Megan does go in there, she does get Davin to open up, and she does make a major breakthrough that like puts this compound on the map and does something no one else has been able to do before. Also, she does it specifically through a romance, which depending on Davin's orientation might really have been impossible for a man to manage. And Megan making a breakthrough through love instead of like actual scientific investigation and know-how is reinforcing like stereotypical tropes about women being all about emotions and being good at that kind of thing and not being good in STEM. So instead of Megan being like smart, resourceful, able to puzzle through things and come to like a new breakthrough, all she had to do was feel enough to make it happen. I think this book is really trying to be feminist. It's really trying to like show these examples and encourage girls to like follow their heart and do what they're passionate about, even if that's something that's a little bit unusual. But then it doesn't really follow through on this, like by complaining when people are sexist to you, or by showing someone actually being analytically minded, breaking down the science, or maybe showing someone as a full person, both emotion and scientific logic and steps. I don't know, maybe I'm asking too much for this book, maybe this is something you would see further in on the series, but all of it struck me as kind of like icky and very muddy messaging. I don't really know why Krista Street decided to market this book to young adults. I think that was a major misstep on her part, especially because it doesn't seem like she's capable for writing to that audience. Overall, I would just say this was a bonkers book with an insane plot. You kind of have to like read to fully experience and immerse yourself in, but hopefully I gave you a couple quick highlights if you're looking for a bit of a rant breakdown. Thank you guys so much for going on this journey with me. Talk to me in those comments down below. What is one book you read meant for teens that while you were reading it, you thought perhaps no teen should ever be forced to experience? And if you got this far with nothing else to say, leave me a magnifying glass in those comments down below. And as always, keep reading.